This is a fine specimen of the oldest and lowest of the existing lakes. It lies about 8 miles above Yosemite Valley, on the main branch of the Merced, at an elevation of about 50 feet above the sea, and is everywhere so securely cliff-bound that without artificial trails, only wild animals can get down to its rocky shores from any direction. Its original length was about a mile and a half, and now it is only a mile and a half in length by about a fourth of a mile in width. And over the lowest portion of the basin, 98 feet deep, its crystal waters are clasped down on the north and south by majestic granite walls, sculptured in true Yosemite style into domes, gables, and battlemented headlands, which on the south come plunging down from sheared into deep water from a height of from 1,500 to 2,000 feet. The South Lyell Glacier eroded this magnificent basin out of solid polyrific granite while forcing its way westward from the summit fountains towards Yosemite, and the exposed rock around the shores and the projecting bosses of the walls, ground and burnished beneath the vast ice flood, still glow with silvery radiance, notwithstanding the innumerable corroding storms that have fallen upon them. The general conformation of this basin, as well as the moraines laid upon the top of the walls, and the grooves and scratches of the bottom and sides, indicate in the most unmistakable manner the direction pursued by this mighty ice river, its great depth and tremendous energy it exerted in thrusting itself into and out of the basin, bearing down with superior pressure upon this portion of its channel, because of the greater declivity, consequently eroding it deeper than the other portions about it, and producing the lake bowl as the necessary result. With these magnificent ice characters so vividly before us, it is not easy to realize that the old glacier that made them vanished tens of centuries ago. For expecting the vegetation that has sprung up and the changes effected by an earthquake that hurled rock avalanches from the weaker headlands, the basin as a whole presents the same appearance that it did when they first brought to light the lake itself. However, has undergone marked changes. One sees at a glance that it is growing old. More than 2/3 of its original area is now dry land, covered with meadow grasses and groves of pine and fir, and the level bed of alluvium stretching from wall to wall. At the head is evidently growing out all along its lakeward margins, and will at length close the lake forever. Every lover of fine wilderness would delight to saunter on a summer day through the flowery groves now occupying the filled-up portion of the basin. The curving shore is clearly traced by a ribbon of white sand upon which the ripples play. Then comes a belt of broad-leaf sedges, interrupted here and there by impenetrable tangles of willows. Beyond this, there are groves of trembling aspen, then a dark, shadowy belt of two-leaved pine, with here and there a round of carex meadow and conch nest-like in its midst, and calmarotis with purple spikes and panicles arching to one's shoulders, while the open meadow patches grow throughout the summer with showy flowers. Heleniums, goldenrods, erigeans, lupins, castillas, and lilies, and form favorite and feeding grounds for bears and deer. The rugged south wall is feathered darkly along the top with an imposing array of spiry silver firs, while the rifted precipices all the way down to the water's edges are adorned with picturesque old junipers, their cinnamon-colored bark showing finely upon the neutral gray of the granite. These, with a few venturesome dwarf pines and spruces, lean out ever fissured ribs and tablets, or stand erect back in the shadowy niches in an indescribably wild and fearless manner. Moreover, the white-flowered Douglas spira and dwarf evergreen oak form graceful fringes over the narrow seams, wherever the slightest hold can be effected. Rock ferns, too, are here, such as the Losius palacea and Chilates, making handsome rosettes on the drier fissures, and the delicate maidenhair, Cystopraesis, and Woodsia hide back in the mossy grottos, moistened by some trickling rill. Then the orange wallflowers hold up its showy panicles here and there in the sunshine, and bahia making bosses of gold. But notwithstanding all this plant beauty, the general impression in looking across the lake is of stern, unflinching rockiness. The ferns and flowers are scarcely seen, but not 1/50th of the whole surface is screened with plant life. The sunnier north wall is more varied in sculpture, but the general tone is the same. A few headlands, flat-topped and soil-covered, support clumps of cedar and pine, and upcurving tangles of chickpin and live oak growing on rough earthquake taluses girdle their bases. Small streams come cascading down between them, their forming margins brightened with gay pimulas, gilias, and emulises. And close along their shore on this side there is a strip of rocky meadow enabled with buttercups, daisies, and white violets, and the purple-topped grasses. Out on its beveled border dip their leaves into water. The lower edge of the basin is a dam-like wells of solid granite, heavily abraded by the old glacier, but scarce at all cut into as yet by the outflowing stream, though it has flowed on unceasingly since the lake came into existence. As soon as the stream is fairly over the lakelet, it breaks down into cascades, never for a moment halting, and scarce abating one jot of its glad energy until it reaches the next filled-up basin, a mile below, then swirling and curving drowsily through meadow and grove. It breaks forth anew into gray rapids and falls, leaping and gliding in glorious exuberance of wild bound and dance, down into yet another filled-up lake basin. Then, after a long rest in the levels of Little Yosemite, it makes its grandest display in the famous Nevada Fall. Out of the clouds of spray at the foot of the fall, the battered, roaring river gropes its way, makes another fall of cascades and rapids, rests a moment in emerald pool, then plunges over the grand cliff of the vernal fall, and goes thundering and chafing down a boulder-choked gorge of tremendous depth and wildness into tranquil reaches, of the old Yosemite Lake basins. The color beauty of Vouch Shadow Lake during the Indian summer is much richer than one would hope to find in so young and so glacial a wilderness. Almost every leaf is tinted then, and the golden rods are in bloom, but most of the color is given by the ripe grasses, willows, and aspens. At the foot of the lake you stand in a troubling aspen grove, every leaf painted like a butterfly, and away to right and left around the shores sweeps a curving ribbon of meadow, red and brown dotted with pale yellow, shading off here and there into hazy purple. The walls, too, are dashed with bits of bright color that gleam out on the neutral granite gray. But neither the walls nor the margin is meadow, nor yet the gay fluttering belonging to the main aspen belt of the basin, which seems the very fountain, hence all the color below it had flowed. And here your eye is filled and fixed. The glorious mass is about 30 feet high and extends upon the basin nearly from wall to wall. Rich bosses of willow flame in front of it, and from here the base of these the brown meadow comes forward to the water's edge, the whole being relieved against the unyielding green of the coniferae, while thick sun gold is poured out over it. During the blessed colored days, no cloud darkens the sky, the winds are gentle, and the landscape rests, hushed everywhere, and indescribably impressive. A few ducks are usually seen sailing on the lake, apparently more for pleasure than anything else, and the ouzels of the head of the rapids sing always, while robins, grosbeaks, and the Douglas squirrels are so busy in the groves, making delightful company, and intensifying the feeling of grateful sequential without ruffling the deep hushed calm and peace. This autumnal mellowness usually lasts until the end of November. Then come days of quite another kind. The winter clouds grow and bloom and shed their starry crystals on every leaf and rock, and all the colors vanish like a sunset. The deer gather and hasten down their well-known trails, fearful of being snowbound. Storm succeeds storm, heaping snow on the cliffs and meadows and bending the slender pines to the ground in wide arches, one over the other, clustering and interlacing like lodged wheat. Avalanches rush and boom from the shelving heights, piling immense heaps upon the frozen lakes. And all the summer glory is bound and lost, yet in the midst of this hearty winter, the sun shines, warms at times, calling the Douglas squirrel to frisk in the snowy pines and sneak out its hidden stores. And the weather is never so severe as to drive away the grouse and little nuthatches and chickadees. Toward May, the lake begins to open. The sun sends down innumerable streams over the cliffs, streaking them round and round with foam. The snow slowly vanishes and the meadows show tintings of green. Then spring comes on apace. Flowers and flies enrich the air and the sod, and the deer come back to the upper groves like birds to an old nest. I first discovered this charming lake in the autumn of 1872, while on my way to the glaciers at the head of the river. It was rejoicing then in its gayest colors, untrodden, hidden in the glacious wilderness like unmined gold. Year after year I walked its shores without discovering any trace of humanity. Then the remains of an old Indian campfire. and the thigh bones of a deer which had been broken to get at the marrow. It lies out of the regular ways of the Indians, who live to hunt in more accessible fields adjacent to trails. Their knowledge of deer haunts has probably enticed them here from some hunger time when they wish to make sure of a feast, for hunting in this lake hollow is like hunting in a fenced park. I had told the beauty of Shadow Lake only to a few friends, fearing it might come to be trampled and improved like Yosemite. On my last visit, I was sauntering along the shore of the strip of sand between the sand, water, and sod, reading the tracks of the wild animals that live here. I was startled by a human track, which I had once saw belonged to some shepherd, for each step was turned out 35 or 40 degrees from the general course pursued, and was also run over in uncertain sprawling fashion at the heel, while a row of round dots on the right indicated the staff that shepherds carry. None but a shepherd could make such a track, and after tracing it a few minutes, I began to fear that he might be seeking pasturage. For what else could he be seeking? Returning from the glaciers shortly afterward, nay, worse fears were realized. A trail had been made down the mountainside from the north, and all the gardens and meadows were destroyed by a horde of hoofed locusts. As if swept by a fire, the money changers were in the temple. Besides their larger canyon lakes fed by main canyon streams, there are many smaller ones lying aloft in the top of the rock benches, entirely independent of the general drainage channels, and of course drawing their supplies from a near limited area. Notwithstanding, there are mostly small and shallow, owing to their immunity from avalanche, detritus, and the inwashings of powerful streams. They often endure longer than others, many times larger, but less favorably situated. When the very shallow, they became dry towards the end of summer, but because their basins are ground out of seamless stone, they suffer no loss save from evaporation alone, and the great depth of snow that falls, lasting into June, makes their dry season short in any case. Orange Lake is a fair illustration of this bench form. It lies in the middle of a beautiful glacier pavement near the lower margin of the lake line, about a mile and a half to the northwest of the Shadow Lake. It is only about 100 yards in circumference. Next the mountain, there is a girdle of terraces with wide overarching pines. Then in regular order a shaggy ruff of huckleberry bushes, a zone of willows with here and there a bush of mountain ash, then a zone of aspens and a few pines around the outside. These zones are of course concentric and together form a wall beyond which the naked ice-burnished granite stretches away in every direction, leaving it conspicuously relieved like a bunch of palms in the desert. In autumn, when the colors are ripe, the whole circular grove at a little distance looks like a big handful of flowers set in a cup to be kept fresh. A tuft of goldenrods. Its feeding streams are exceedingly beautiful, notwithstanding their inconsistency and extreme shallowness. They have no channel whatever, and consequently are left free to spread in thin sheets upon the shining granite and wander at will. In many places the current is less than a fourth of an inch deep, and flows with so little friction it is scarcely visible. Sometimes there is not a single foam bell or drifting pine needle, or irregularity of any sort to manifest its motion. Yet, when observed narrowly, it is seen to form a web of gliding lacework, exquisitely woven, giving beautiful reflections from its minute, curving ripples and eddies, and differing from the water laces of large cascades and being everywhere transparent in spring. When the snow is melting, the lake bowl is brimming full and sends forth quite a large stream that slips glassily from 200 yards or so, or until it comes to an almost vertical precipice 800 feet high, down which it plunges into a fine cataract. Then it gathers its scattered waters and goes smoothly over folds of gently tipping granite to its confluence with the main canyon stream. During the greater portion of the year, however, not a single water sound will you hear either at the head or the foot of the lake. Not over in the whispered lappings of ripple waves along the shore, for the winds are fenced out, but the deep mountain silence is sweetened now, and then by birds that stop here to rest and drink on their way across the canyon. A beautiful variety of the benchtop lakes occurs just where the great lateral moraines of the main glaciers have been shoved forward in outswelling concentric rings by small residential tributary glaciers. Instead of being encompassed by a narrow ring of trees like Orange Lake, these lie embossed in deep, dense moraine woods, so dense that in seeking them, you may pass them by again and again, until you may know nearly where they lie concealed. Lake Star King, lying to the north of the cone of that name, above the little Yosemite Valley, is a fine specimen of this variety, that owls pass it by, as do the ducks. They could hardly get into it, even if they could, without plumping straight down to the inside circling trees. Yet these isolated gems, lying like fallen fruit detached from the branches, are not altogether without inhabitants and joyous animating visitors. Of course, fishes cannot get into them, and this is generally true of nearly every glacial lake in the range. But they all are well stocked with happy frogs. How did the frogs get into them in the first place? Perhaps their sticky spawn was carried in on the feet of ducks or other birds. Else their progenitors must have made some exciting excursions through the woods and up the sides of the canyons. Down in the still, pure depths of these hidden lakelets, you may also find the larvae of innumerable insects and a great variety of beetles, while the air above them is thick with humming wings, through the midst of which flycatchers are constantly darting. And in autumn, when the huckleberries are ripe, bands of robins and grosbeaks come in to feast, forming altogether delightful little by-worlds for the naturalist. Pushing our way upward towards the axis of the range, we find lakes in greater and greater abundance, and more youthful in aspect, and at elevation of about 9,000 feet above them, sea level, they seem to have arrived at middle age. That is, their basins seem to be about half filled with alluvium. Broad sheets of meadow land are seen extending into them, imperfect and boggy in many places, and more nearly near level than those of the older lakes below them, and the vegetation of their shores is of course more alpine. Kalmia, lodum, and cassiope fringe the meadow rocks, while the luxuriant waving groves, so characteristic of the lower lakes, are represented only by clumps of the dwarf pine and the hemlock spruce. These, however, are oftentimes very picturesquely grouped on rocky headlands, around the outer rim of the meadows, of or with still more striking effect, crown some rocky islet. Moreover, from causes that we cannot stop here to explain, the cliffs about these middle-aged lakes are seldom of the massive Yosemite type, but are more broken and less sheer than they usually stand back, leaving the shores comparatively free, while the few precipitous rocks that do come forward and plunge directly into deep water are seldom more than 400 feet high. I have never yet met ducks in any of the lakes of this kind, but the Ozul is never wanting where the feeding streams are perennial. Wild sheep and deer will occasionally be seen on the meadows, and very rarely a bear. One might camp on the rugged shores of these bright fountains for weeks without meeting any animal larger than the marmots burrowing beneath the glacier-bound boulders along the edges of the meadow. The highest and youngest of all the lakes lie in glacial wombs. At first sight, they seem pictures of pure, bloodless desolation, miniature Arctic seas bound in perpetual ice and snow and overshadowed by harsh, gloomy, crumbling precipices. Their waters are keen ultramarine blue in the deepest parts, lively green, grass green towards the shore, shallows and around the edges of the small bergs, usually floating about in them. A few hardy sedges, frost-pinched in every night, and occasionally found making softened sods along the untouched portions of their shores. And when their northern banks are slope openly to the south and are soil covered, no matter how coarsely, they are sure to be brightened with flowers. One lake in the particular snow now comes to mind, which illustrates the floweriness of the sun-touched banks of the icy gems. Close up under the shadow of the Sierra Matterhorn, on the eastern slope of its range lies one of the iciest of the glaciers at an elevation of about 12,000 feet. A short, ragged, edged glacier crawls into it from the south. On the opposite side of it, embanked and dammed by a series of concentric terminal moraines made by the glacier when it entirely filled the basin. Half a mile below lies the second lake at a height of 11,500 feet, about as cold and pure as snow crystal. The waters of the first come gurgling down into it and through the moraine dam, while a second stream pours into it direct from a glacier that lies to the southeast. Sheer precipices of crystalline snow rise out of deep water on the south, keeping perpetual winter on that side, and there is a fine summery spot on the other. Notwithstanding, the lake is about 300 yards wide. Here, on August 25th, 1873, I found a charming company of flowers, not pinched, crouching dwarves, scarce able to look up but warm and juicy, standing erect in rich cherry color in bloom, on a narrow strip of shingle close to the water's edge. There were a few tufts of carrots gone to seed, and a little far back up the rocky bank at the foot of a crumbling wall so inclined as to absorb and radiate as well as reflect a considerable quantity of sun heat was the garden, containing a thrifty thicket of Cauwania covered with large yellow flowers, several bushes of the alpine ribs with berries nearly ripe and weirdly acidic, a few handsome grasses belonging to the two distinct species, and one goldenrod, a few hairy lupines and radiant spragues, whose blue and rose-colored flowers were set off to a fine advantage amid green carices, and along a narrow seam in the very warmest angle of the wall, a perfectly gorgeous fringe of Epiblumi abcordiatum, flowers at an inch wide, crowded together in lavish profusion, and colored as royal a purple as ever was worn by any hybrid plants of the tropics. And best of all, and greatest of all, a noble thistle in full bloom, standing erect head and shoulders above his companions, thrusting out his lances in sturdy vigor as if growing on a Scottish brae. All this brave warm blood among the raw stones, right in the face of the onlooking glaciers. As far as I have been able to find out, these upper lakes are now snow-buried in winter to a depth of 35 or 40 feet, and those most exposed to avalanches to a depth of even 100 feet or more. These last are, of course, nearly lost to the landscape. Some remain buried for years, and the snowfall is especially great, and many only rely only on one side late in the season. The snow of the closed side is composed of coarse granules compacted and frozen into firm, faintly striated mass. Like the neve of a glacier, the lapping waves of the ocean portion gradually undermine and cause it to break off in large masses like icebergs, which give rise to a precipitous front like the discharging wall of a glacier entering the sea. The play of the lights among the crystal angels of the snow cliffs, the pearly whites of the outstanding bosses, the bergs drifting in snow front, aglow in the sun and edged with green water, and the deep blue disk of the lake itself extending to your feet. This forms a picture that encroaches all your afterlife and is never forgotten. But however perfect the season and the day, the cold incompleteness of these young lakes is always cleanly felt. We approach them with a kind and of mean caution, and steal unconfidingly around their crystal shores, dashed and ill at ease, as if expecting to hear some forbidding voice. But the love songs of the ozels and the love looks of the daisies gradually reassure us, and manifest the warm fountain humanity that pervades the coldest and most solitary of them all.